want to show you how to build and install a shoulder vise. If you don't know what a shoulder vise is, it is this apparatus here, attaches onto the side of your workbench. What it allows you to do is have vicing capability with no rods or screws that are going to interfere below your clamping surface, which allows you to put boards in upright to do dovetailing or on any angle, but also use it as you would a traditional front vise like so. For those of you who are fairly capable and want to just jump right in, I'll quickly explain the really key components and then I'll go into more detail in a second. To have a shoulder vise, you need some support underneath. So if your bench is not set up for that, you can make it set up for that. You just need to add some support, which is this bit just here. Also, you've got a lot of force pushing against the table, pushing this arm away from the table. So you need to make sure this whole shoulder operation is really strong. And the way you do that is a combination of glue and also threaded rod embedded through the shoulder into the workbench with some workbench lugs, some brass lugs embedded underneath. Your screw component is embedded right through this arm here, and the jaw, the actual face of the vise, sits in a little slot like a tongue and groove here, and that stops it from falling out. Those are your basic components. If you want to go ahead from there, go nuts. In terms of actual dimensions, that's really up to you. I've split my shoulder is about 230 millimeters long. My vise length here, my face of my vise is about 250 millimeters long. The amount of vise throat I have, or actual screw capability, is around 190 mil, maybe a little bit less. This particular screw from Balladonia will allow me to do more, but for the kind of use that this shoulder vise is going to get, that was more than enough for me, and I didn't want to make the entire shoulder just way too wide. Structurally, in terms of gluing timber together, this is all pretty simple. The only complex thing, well, one of the complex things, is getting a really long hole so you can place your threaded rod. Well, you need two holes actually. So you can place your threaded rod all the way through the arm, the shoulder, and into the body of the workbench. The way that I did that was I constructed my arm and my shoulder separately. I used the same stock that I made the workbench top from, and then I made sure that I thicknessed that arm and the shoulder down to all exactly the same thickness. What that allowed me to do was actually use the arm as a template to drill the holes in the pieces of timber that I laminated together to form the shoulder. Unless you have a 300mm long 13mm drill bit, you're not going to be able to drill all the way through the 6 pieces, well in my case, 6 pieces of 35mm thick timber to get that one continuous hole. So I had to do each one of those pieces separately by using the arm as the template. Now, in the video you'll see that I'm actually using a 13mm spade bit, and while that is fairly quick, it doesn't form the most straight hole, which I found I was having to then kind of enlarge a little bit afterwards. So I would suggest using a 13mm regular drill bit. You'll get a more parallel hole. It doesn't matter if these holes are a little oversized because it'll never be seen. The threaded rod that you'll be using is 1/2 inch UNC, and the reason we're using that is because it fits perfectly in these brass workbench lugs. These Workbench lugs I picked up at TimberCon, and they come with these standard 1/2" hex-headed bolts. But the bolts aren't long enough to do this particular operation of threading right into the the top of the workbench. So the threaded rod is about 12.6 millimeters or 1/2" thick. Your hole should be 13, 14, anything around there will be suitable. Once you have pre-drilled all of those blanks that will form your shoulder, lay them all together, clamp them, and make sure you can pass the threaded rod through fairly easily. If you can't, you need to go through and enlarge each of those holes. What I found is that each one of my holes was on a slight pitch just because of the bit that I was using, and my operation of drilling through the arm wasn't quite straight enough, so I then needed to just straighten each one of those out until I could pass that rod through really freely. Keep in mind that before you drill the face plate of your arm with your 13 millimeter hole, you'll need to first drill out a large countersink to fit the nut and washer that holds the face of the arm on as well, because you can't countersink after you've pre-drilled that center hole. Once the holes are drilled in the arm and the shoulder, you also want to use the arm to drill the holes that you need into the top of the workbench. They're just continuations of the same hole, and you need the threaded rod to pass all the way in as well. My threaded rod goes about 100 mil into my workbench. That just sat conveniently in the center of a piece of timber, and that allowed me to then place the hole for the brass nut up from underneath, which you can see here. You won't actually be drilling the hole for these brass lugs until you've fully glued and installed the shoulder and the arm onto the workbench itself. But assuming you've got all those holes lined up, you want to clamp your body of the shoulder together into one piece, and you also want to make sure you've clamped your arm together. So at this point, you should have your arm, you should have your shoulder, and then you've got your workbench. Thickness them all to make sure that they're exactly the same thickness, or the same thickness as your workbench top, so that you get a really nice flush surface. You will also need to, at this point, cut the slot in your shoulder here. Now, I cut that with a straight bit on the router table. That's the simplest way that I could figure out to do it. You want to do a corresponding tongue on the faceplate of your vise. I just did that on the bandsaw. It's not a super precise join because it's not a tight fit. You want it to have a bit of play. That's why the bandsaw worked fine. After you've cleaned up your arm and your shoulder, you've got that groove in there, you want to install this giant screw lug, or the nut that holds the vice screw, into the arm itself. Now, the best way to do that is just to use a Forstner bit to bore the large hole that you need to fit that collar deep into the arm. Now, this socket that you're going to be inserting into the arm that holds the screw needs a hole bored that's about 45 mil wide by around 40, it's a little bit more than 40 mil deep. I found that I had to deepen mine because it was hitting on the bottom. You'll want to make sure that you drill that large hole that fits this socket before you drill the hole for the actual screw component. I found that a 45 mil Forstner bit gave a really nice tight fit, but I needed to put a slight round over on the top edge of that hole to account for the round over in the cast steel here. And then I got a really nice firm fit. I decided not to embed this square outer collar of this component into my timber because I didn't want to take away any more meat, any more timber from my arm. But if you've got a really nice thick arm that you're building, you could by all means countersink or recess that right in flush. It would give you potentially a little more distance to travel in your vise itself, a little more clamping capacity. I didn't feel like I needed it, and like I said, I wanted the strength in my arm. Once you have drilled a large hole that will fit this, you then need to go and drill the hole for the screw itself. I wanted my hole to be fairly firm because I didn't want a whole lot of play in this screw or any additional play. A 30mm Forstner bit will do a great job and get you a firm fit that is not too tight. I did find that I needed to wax this screw a little bit just to get a really nice smooth movement, and I'm sure that as I use this vise more, the movement of the screw will just inherently open up that hole in the timber a little bit more so it becomes even smoother. Once you've done all that drilling, you can then install this collar into the timber. I just used some large cup head screws, pre-drilled them and screwed that right in. You need to do it before you assemble the arm and the shoulder and the actual workbench top, because otherwise you'll have a hard time getting in there. You can then glue the arm, the shoulder onto the top of the workbench. When you're doing that, you want to really make sure that the threaded rod still passes through that whole operation, but I wouldn't leave the threaded rod in there while you're gluing because it could get potentially stuck, and you want to make sure that you can get it out again. So clamp them in place, make sure you can pass your threaded rod right through to the end, then remove the threaded rod and wait for it all to dry. Once that's all glued together, you can flip the entire workbench over and go through the simple process of installing these brass lugs. The first thing you need to do is to locate the position that they need to go in. I did this by measuring the position of the holes on the outside of my arm, which in my case was 50mm in and 200mm in. I transferred those measurements onto the underside of the table and then decided how deep I wanted these to sit. These brass lugs are 25mm wide, and in my workbench build for the legs, I drilled a hole that was only 26mm and they fit in really nice and snug. But because the holes that we've drilled are so long, we need to account for any inaccuracy, which is a natural part of this kind of build. And so I actually ended up drilling a 28mm hole for these lugs, and that just gave me a little bit more play to account for any, basically just inaccuracy in the direction of the threaded rod where it comes into the hole that the lug sits. Once your hole is drilled for your lugs, you can slide them in there. I used a bit of gaffer tape to make sure I could hold them at the right height. I waxed up the threaded rod really well and tapped that in until it was just holding in the mouth of this lug. And then I started tightening that up. Once you've tightened up those bolts, you can flip the workbench over, and then we can move on to placing the screw into the vise and putting the face plate or the jaws onto the vise. The apparatus that holds the jaws can be set up to be quick release. I suppose this would allow you to remove that jaw and remove the screw if you needed to place this edge of the workbench up against a wall, for instance, and you wanted to gain a little bit more space. I decided to install this plate, the mounting plate, in a way that does not come off super easily, as in the quick release is facing the opposite direction. That just means that I had to pre-drill all of those holes and then finish tightening those countersunk screws with a little tiny hand wrench I use Robinson screws, so I was able to use, a large Robinson bit to get them tightened up. When I put the large screw in, I waxed that fairly consistently across the whole screw to allow just really smooth travel through the nut itself. And then I also sanded and waxed the inside of the tongue and groove system that holds the jaw into the shoulder to make sure I've got really nice smooth travel. That's the extent of all of the structural elements of this build. You'll then need to make or buy some sort of handle. I just cut some square stock out of the red gum, put a round over on all the edges, brought it down to about 26 or 27 millimeters, and that fits in nicely. I might need to put some ball ends on these, but right now it's a pretty nice snug fit and it's not falling out. I quite like it that way. It makes it easy for me to pull it in and out if I need to. I'll also put a bit of a round over on these edges, especially on the outer corner here where I'm likely to hit my hip as I'm moving around the bench. And I'll smooth off some of these other faces when I finish off the entire workbench. In terms of the installation of the shoulder vise, that's basically it. I would periodically check that the threaded rod and those nuts are nice and firm, because as the wood contracts, you want to make sure that you're keeping pressure on those joints so that the glue joints aren't the ones holding the force of that vise, that clamping action. You want that really to be supported by the threaded rod at all times.